Some people don't wear uniforms, they carry their service in silence. Harrison Ford hadn't been to that mountain town in years, but when the snow returned, so did he. No name tag, no ceremony. Just a quiet promise he'd made to a boy's father, and the kind of presence that changes everything without saying a word. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. We've got more like this coming your way. Some people enter a room and demand attention. Others walk in, and the air shifts without a sound. That morning, the snow hadn't started falling yet, but the chill had already crept into the corners of the little roadside diner. It was one of those old Colorado places, flag in the window, cracked leather booths, coffee that tasted like memory. The kind of spot locals claimed as theirs, especially around the holidays. The bell above the door didn't ring loud. It gave a tired jingle, like it had rung too many winters already. The man who entered didn't look up. He stepped inside with slow, steady purpose, boots dusted in road salt, shoulders draped in a weather-beaten leather jacket. A canvas duffel bag hung from one hand, its strap frayed, edges worn like the man had carried it too far and for too long. His baseball cap was pulled low, shadowing eyes that didn't need to be seen to be felt. Kyle, the young waiter near the register, glanced up from the screen of his phone. His nose wrinkled. He gave the man a once-over, boots, jeans, jacket, the whole image, and then nodded sharply toward the back. "That table's reserved," he said, already turning away. The man paused, not insulted, not surprised. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder and looked toward the corner booth, then to a small table by the window, half lit by the morning sun, one chair slightly crooked, its plastic edge cracked and taped. "I'm not here for lunch," the man said, voice low, even, "just a place to sit, and maybe a glass of water." Kyle didn't reply. He just shrugged and walked off, muttering something under his breath about holiday drifters and not our problem. No one else noticed. Not the family eating pancakes, not the couple by the window, not the cook yelling orders in the kitchen. But someone in the back did, someone young. Someone who had heard a story once, late at night, about a man in a leather jacket who never gave his name. The old man sat. Slowly, he placed his bag down beside the chair, careful not to scuff the floor. His fingers brushed a spot clean on the table. The chair creaked as he leaned back. No one brought him water. No one asked him why he was there, and he didn't explain. He didn't flinch when the door slammed behind a group of loud teenagers. He didn't move when a toddler threw a fork across the floor. He just sat still, calm, quiet. He didn't come to be served. He came to keep a promise. And though no one knew it yet, that promise was about to change everything. Somewhere behind the kitchen window, a young line cook dropped his spoon and stared, eyes wide, lips parted. The spoon clattered to the floor, then he ran. The clatter of silverware, the low hum of conversations, and the hiss of eggs on a griddle filled the diner with a kind of practiced warmth. Regulars sipped their coffee, napkins tucked under chins, waitresses moved with memorized routes, and the special of the day, meatloaf with gravy, was already moving fast. No one had time for slow. Kyle returned to the register, flipping a pen between his fingers. He watched the old man by the window with the same look someone might give a stain on a clean floor, annoyed more by the presence than the reason. "Hey," he called, louder this time, eyes narrowing. "If you're not ordering, you can't just sit there. We're full up." The man didn't move. He glanced out the window, snow beginning to dance just beyond the glass. "I said you need to order something," Kyle snapped, "or at least act like you belong here." No response. A woman 2 booths down leaned toward her husband, whispering behind her coffee cup. "He looks like one of those homeless drifters. Bet he's just keeping warm." The husband grunted without looking. From the kitchen, the owner stepped out. Miles Peterson, heavy-set, late 50s, starched apron, shoes that clicked too loud. He walked like someone who thought owning a space meant owning everyone in it. His eyes swept the room once, and when they landed on the man at the window, they narrowed. "Kyle," he said under his breath, "he's not one of ours, move him." Kyle nodded, already heading over. "We've got families coming in," Miles added. "Don't need people getting uncomfortable." The table next to the window cleared. A party of 4 stood to leave, passing the old man without so much as a glance. Kyle took the opening. "We've got a spot for you outside," he said, tone fake friendly, "heated lamp and everything." The man looked at the door. Wind howled against it, a brief spray of snow curling beneath as someone stepped out. "It's all right," he said quietly. "I'll take it." He stood slowly, lifted his bag. His movements were deliberate, not defiant, not broken, just steady, like someone who had walked away from worse. Kyle led him through the side door to a metal table just outside the main window. The patio was technically part of the diner, but no one sat there in December. The heater sputtered more than it warmed. The chair was metal, cold, and slightly off balance. The man didn't complain. He set his bag down, pulled out a cloth, faded blue, worn at the corners, and gently wiped the layer of frost off the tabletop. Then he sat. The chair wobbled, the wind bit at his sleeves, but he didn't flinch. Just placed both hands on the table, folded, and waited. Inside, a young woman, alone at a booth, watched through the window, her brow furrowed. She started to rise, then paused. Her hand hovered above her purse, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether it was her place. A second later, she sat back down. Coffee grew cold beside her. Miles turned to Kyle. "Make sure no one bothers him, but don't serve him unless he orders. We are not a shelter." Kyle laughed. "Yeah, got it." No one questioned it, not the customers, not the staff. They just watched the man outside through the fogged-up glass. Like he was part of the landscape, something to be looked past, not at. But he didn't look back. He stared forward, toward nothing in particular, as the snow began to settle gently on the edge of his jacket. And when the first flake touched his hand, he didn't brush it off. He'd sat in colder places and waited for colder reasons. The sky had broken open that night in 2016. Rain fell sideways, wind howled like it had bones to break, and the mountains of northern Wyoming were no longer solid. They flowed, turned to rivers, then to walls. Roads disappeared. Trees vanished into the dark. And a truck, old and rusted, skidded off a soaked gravel road and lodged itself against a dying pine at the edge of a ravine. Inside, a man in his 30s clutched the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. His son, 6 years old, wide-eyed, barefoot, sat curled in the passenger seat, wrapped in a wet hoodie that didn't fit. The water was already up to the floorboards, creeping. The man had tried to call. No signal. He tried the radio. Dead. So he sat there, one hand on his boy's chest, the other gripping a pocket knife, not knowing what else to do but whisper, "It'll be all right," over and over like a chant, like a lie he wanted to believe. And then the sound came. Not thunder, not the roar of water. This was mechanical, chopping the air with purpose. A sound no one expected that night because no one had been cleared to fly. The boy looked up. His father leaned out the window, blinking through rain. A light cut through the storm, then another, then the shape, black against a darker sky, descending fast. A civilian chopper, older model, not marked, no rescue insignia, no state seal, just steel and resolve. It hovered low, wind blasting water across the hillside. A rope dropped. Then a man followed. Leather jacket, helmet low, rope clipped to his belt. No words, no shouting, just a gesture, flat palm, "Wait here." He made it to the truck. Opened the door, looked the father in the eye. "We have to go," the father said. "The water S." The man raised one finger, then turned to the boy. And for the first time, the child looked into his face. Not a rescuer's face, not a superhero's. A face that had seen too much. Lined, soaked, unreadable, but the eyes, soft, steady, heavy, with something the boy couldn't name. The boy held out a scrap of blue cloth. It had torn from the bandana his father used as a sling when he broke his arm. He tied it around the man's wrist without asking. "You won't lose us now," the boy whispered. The man said nothing, just nodded once. They lifted out together, rotors shaking trees and hearts. The boy never saw him again. But he remembered the eyes, not fierce, not fearless, just tired, like they had stayed open too long. Back in the present, outside the diner, snow gathered at the corner of the old man's sleeve. Inside his pocket was the same cloth, faded, frayed, still tied with the knot from a child's hand. He didn't come for food. He came to honor the promise that Knot had made. The midday rush had settled into its rhythm. Plates clinked, syrup dripped onto laminated menus, and laughter bounced off tiled floors like it belonged there. The diner buzzed with the kind of comfort only routine could build. No one noticed the man outside anymore. He was just a shadow on the patio, a blur behind fogged glass. Kyle, wiping his hands on his apron, glanced toward the window and narrowed his eyes. The old man was still there, still hadn't ordered, still hadn't moved, a nuisance wrapped in a coat. Miles, standing near the coffee machine, leaned in. "He's making us look bad," he muttered. "Fix it." Kyle rolled his shoulders like he'd been given a mission. He grabbed a half-filled cup of house coffee, lukewarm, burnt, bitter, and pushed through the patio door with more force than necessary. The cold slapped him on the face. He ignored it. "All right," Kyle said, stepping closer to the table. "This is your last shot. Order something or leave." The man didn't look up. Kyle shifted his weight. "I'm not gonna ask again." Nothing. Not a blink, not a breath. Just the quiet hum of wind against metal and the man's fingers resting calmly on the table's edge. Kyle's jaw tightened. With no warning, he tipped the cup forward. Coffee splashed onto the table, across the man's hands, and down the front of his jacket. The liquid spread quickly, seeping into worn leather, running across old stitching, down the collarbone. Some of it hit the edge of the duffel bag on the ground. The bag tipped slightly. It rolled. Then it opened. The sketchbook spilled out first. The pages fanned slightly before settling against the concrete, one corner stained from the water. A cloth followed, blue, faded, tied in a neat knot that looked too careful to be careless. A folded piece of paper, too, yellowed, handwritten. For a moment, no one moved. The old man blinked once, then calmly reached down, gathered his things. He picked up the cloth, gently brushed off the dirt, and tucked it back into the duffel without a word. Inside the diner, a man at the counter stood halfway up. He had seen everything, but Miles met his eyes and gave a subtle shake of the head. The man sat back down, quietly. The young woman near the window clenched her jaw. Her fork hovered over her plate, untouched, but she didn't move either. Kyle tried to sound smug, but something in his voice cracked. "See, this is why we ask people to leave. Now clean it up." The man didn't respond. He lifted the sketchbook, now damp at the edges, and slid it gently into his bag. Then he sat back down, same chair, same posture. As if nothing had happened, but something had. In the kitchen, behind a narrow view of the dining floor, a teenage boy named Eli was scrubbing trays. He didn't see the whole scene, but he saw enough. The door swinging open, the splash, the bag rolling, the flash of blue cloth hitting the ground, and then his hands stopped moving. He stared, eyes fixed on that cloth, on the knot tied into its edge, a knot he had seen before, a knot his father had shown him once, years ago. On a quiet night after dinner, the night he told him the story of the storm, the helicopter, and the man who never said his name. The spoon Eli had been holding dropped to the floor. He didn't ask permission, he just ran. The kitchen wasn't loud anymore, not for Eli. The orders being called out, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the clink of plates, none of it reached him. He stood frozen behind the prep table, eyes locked on the man outside, on the bag, on the cloth, on the knot. His breath hitched. The same knot his dad had tied, the same cloth he had once been told never to forget. Eli moved. He didn't wipe his hands, didn't say a word to the head cook. Just dropped the pan, shoved open the swinging door, and bolted. Chairs scraped. Heads turned. A few people gasped as the teenage cook in his grease-stained apron ran across the diner floor like something had caught fire. Kyle stepped back, startled. "What the?" Eli didn't stop. He shoved open the patio door. Cold air rushed in behind him, and then, loud enough for the whole room to hear, he shouted, "Stop." Everyone froze. "Don't touch him," Eli yelled, voice shaking. "Please don't touch him." Kyle blinked, confused. What are you even?" Eli ignored him. He kept moving until he reached the table, then dropped to his knees beside the old man. His eyes scanned the jacket, the face, the hands, then finally the bag, the knot. His voice cracked. "It's you," he whispered. "You saved my dad." The old man looked at him, calm, gentle, but said nothing. Eli's hands trembled as he reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a photo, creased, corners soft from time and handling. A boy, 6 years old, clinging to his father's leg. Behind them, barely in frame, stood a man in a leather jacket, helmet under one arm, looking away from the camera. A faint blur of blue cloth was wrapped around his wrist. Eli held up the photo. "That's me," he said. "That's my dad. He told me you came out of the sky. No name, no uniform, just you." Silence fell like snow. Inside the diner, no one moved. Not the waitress holding a tray Medea, not the mother cutting pancakes for her toddler. Not the man who'd started to rise earlier but didn't. Even Kyle stood still, eyes wide, mouth parted. Eli looked up at the man, at Harrison Ford, and his voice steadied. "You didn't just save him," he said. "You saved me. Because if he hadn't made it, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be anything." Ford blinked slowly, then nodded once. Nothing grand, no spotlight, just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who shared a moment neither could forget. Eli stayed on his knees, holding the photo in one hand, the other resting gently on the edge of the table, like he needed to anchor himself to the moment. And behind the glass, the entire diner watched, the man they had dismissed, the boy who remembered, and the truth that tied them together with a single weathered knot. No one spoke, no one moved. The diner, once filled with the everyday noise of plates and small talk, had fallen into a silence so complete it rang in the ears. Forks hovered Medea, coffee cooled in untouched mugs. Even the overhead fan seemed to turn more quietly now. Eli stood slowly, still clutching the photo in one hand. He looked around, his voice unsteady but clear. "My dad never knew his name," he said. "After the storm, after the rescue, they tried to find out who he was, called the county, the hospital, the airfield. No one had him on record. It was like he just appeared." People in the room leaned closer, the world narrowing to this moment. He only remembered the jacket, the duffel bag, and the cloth, this cloth, tied around his wrist. He kept it in a box with our emergency radio. Said, "If that man ever comes back, you show him you remember." Eli held up the faded blue fabric, not still tight, edges darkened with time and rain. The old man at the table didn't move, but inside something shifted. In the back of the room, near the dessert counter, an older gentleman in a veteran's cap leaned toward his wife. "That's Harrison Ford," he whispered. "That's him." The name moved like a ripple. Someone in a corner booth gasped softly. A waitress lowered her tray and blinked hard. The woman near the window who hadn't touched her pancakes now covered her mouth, eyes wide. But the man at the table didn't flinch. He hadn't come to be known. He had come because of a promise. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and a woman stepped out, mid-40s, apron still tied, flower on her sleeve. She was holding something flat in both hands, a photo frame, plastic cover slightly scratched. She walked up beside Eli and placed it on the table. Inside was the same photo, this time clearer, laminated, preserved, same boy, same father, same man in the background, half turned from the camera, same cloth on his wrist. Eli's mother looked at the man sitting across from her son and swallowed hard. "My husband made me promise," she said, voice shaking. "If this man ever walked through that door, I was to say thank you, no matter how many years had passed. No matter what he looked like." The man didn't speak, but his eyes met hers, and that was enough. In the stillness that followed, people began to understand, not from the jacket, not from the photo, but from the way he didn't defend himself. From the way he'd let them misunderstand him, because it was never about being seen. A woman at the register stepped forward, eyes shining. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did he really fly into the canyon during the flood?" Eli nodded. A man behind her added, "But why didn't anyone know? Why didn't anyone say something?" Eli looked at the cloth in his hand. Because he never told anyone, he didn't need to. Then another voice spoke up, from a booth near the window. "I run the community fund in Elk Ridge," the woman said. "For the past 7 years, we've gotten anonymous donations, big ones always marked for flood relief. No names, no letters, just wires and notes that say for the families." She paused. "Every single year, around the same week in April." The pieces clicked, heads turned back toward the man in the cold chair. He didn't nod, didn't confirm, but he also didn't deny. And somehow that silence spoke the loudest. No one told the diners to stand. But one by one they did. Not for a celebrity, not for a headline, but for the man who sat alone in the snow, who had flown into a storm, and who had never once asked to be remembered. Kyle had taken a step back without realizing it. His hands were no longer on his hips. They hung limp by his sides, one still holding the empty coffee cup like it might somehow explain what had just happened. His mouth opened once, then closed. No words came. His face, once smug and quick with orders, now flickered with something else. Confusion, discomfort, and underneath it all shame. Miles stood behind the counter, one hand gripping the edge of the register. He wasn't speaking either. His jaw was locked, and his eyes stayed fixed on the man outside. A minute ago, he had seen just an inconvenience. Now he wasn't sure what he was looking at, but it wasn't nobody. The rest of the diner had quieted into something heavier than silence. Waitresses with pads half filled, customers halfway through bites. Every face turned toward the man at the patio table. He still hadn't stood up, still hadn't spoken. He just reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a napkin, folded once, dabbed gently at the coffee stain on his sleeve. He did it the way someone might brush dust from a gravestone, no rush, no resentment. Then he looked up at Eli. His voice, when it came, was steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "I made a promise to your father," he said, "that I'd come back when you started your first job. Thought I'd be early. Guess I'm right on time." Eli's lips parted, but he couldn't speak. He just nodded, once, then again harder. From behind the counter, Miles moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of heaviness that came from understanding you had missed something important. He walked toward the door, past the booths, past the customers, past the version of himself he'd worn like a uniform. He stepped onto the patio. The wind had softened. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, eyes lowered, hands in front of him, then quietly, "I'm sorry." He looked up. "I didn't see you," he said. "Today, I didn't see anything but what I assumed." The man nodded, not dismissive, not angry, just acknowledgement. "It's all right," he said. Then, after a beat, he added, "Just make sure you look harder next time." Miles swallowed hard. "I will," he said. "I promise." The man smiled, barely, not the smile of someone vindicated, the smile of someone who had been through far worse, and still believed people could learn. 1 week later, the diner looked the same on the outside. Same chipped paint, same rusted signs swaying in the wind, same hum of breakfast orders drifting through the early morning. But inside, something had shifted, not just in the staff, not just in the regulars, in the air itself. Because the story didn't stay in that small Colorado town. It didn't end at the patio table. It started with a leak, a blurry clip from the security camera. No one knew who posted it first. Maybe a cook, maybe a customer who had been quietly filming with their phone, but it spread fast. A teenager running from the kitchen, a cloth falling from a bag. A boy crying out, "That's him, that's the man who saved my dad." And in the center of it all, an old man in a leather jacket, soaked in coffee and silence. The internet did what it always does. It asked questions, dug deeper, and soon the pieces came together. Flight records that never matched a name, anonymous donations to small mountain towns hit by floods, a cloth that hadn't changed in 7 years, and a face, older now, quieter, but unmistakable to those who had once served beside it. The hashtag appeared on day 2, just 4 words: "He saved my dad." Veterans reposted it with photos of old boots and folded flags. Nurses added it under stories of patients who couldn't speak, but had drawn a man with kind eyes and a flight badge. Teachers shared it with clips of their quietest students finally raising their hands. It wasn't about the rescue anymore. It was about being seen. The diner received over 1,000 messages in 3 days. Some were thank you notes. Some were confessions. Most were apologies. Miles posted a letter to the front window, not an excuse, a reflection. He ended it with one sentence: "We judged a man because he didn't look like what we expected. But he was exactly who we needed." Eli's story reached a local radio station, then national news, then an education podcast. Within a week, a crowdfunding campaign started in his name. They called it Eli's Flight, a scholarship fund for teens in rural areas who wanted to learn aviation, mechanics, or rescue operations. Within 72 hours, it passed $200,000. Outside the diner, just to the right of the front door, a new plaque appeared. Brushed steel, clean lines, no logo, no sponsor. It read, "Respect isn't about what you wear, it's about what you carry." No one said who paid for it. But some guessed. On a rainy Thursday, Eli arrived early to his shift. He was unlocking the side door when he noticed a package leaning against the wall. Plain brown paper, no return address. He carried it inside, opened it carefully. Inside was a flight map, not digital, paper, folded and soft from use. Across it, a red marker had traced a flight path, looping into a narrow canyon in Wyoming, then circling back. At the edge of the paper, just below the last turn, someone had written in sharp, deliberate ink, "Next time you fly, no name, just 2 letters, HF." Eli sat for a long time staring at the map. He didn't speak. Just ran his fingers along the route, over the twists and climbs and impossible turns. And he smiled, because he knew what it meant. It meant the story wasn't over, not for him. Not for anyone who had ever been overlooked, misread, or turned away. Later that week, students at a local high school watched the diner clip as part of their media literacy unit. One girl in the back raised her hand and asked why no one saw him sooner. The teacher didn't answer right away. Then she said, quietly, "Sometimes we don't recognize the best people because they don't show up to be recognized. They show up because they promised someone they would." And across the country, small changes started happening. A security guard let an old man into a museum without checking his badge twice. A librarian pulled up a chair for a woman who'd stopped asking for help. A teenager held the door for someone who walked slow. They didn't know why, they just did, because stories like these leave echoes. And sometimes the echo is louder than the moment itself. Harrison Ford was never interviewed, never posted, never appeared on late-night shows, but in a small drawer beneath the diner register, Eli kept the flight map folded tight. Next to it, the blue cloth his father once tied with shaking fingers. And he kept both for the same reason, to remember the man who didn't speak loud, didn't take credit, and didn't walk away when it would have been easier to. Because some promises don't need applause, they just need to be kept. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.